Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another Facebook Live event hosted by Racial Justice Ministries at Scarritt Bennett Center. Today's conversation is featuring 7 Black men from different walks of life to share their own personal experiences with being a Black man in America. These experiences are unique and do not represent all Black men. These are their stories, yet their stories represent a kind of unique experience that is found in the lives of Black and brown people in this country. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about this in The Souls of Black Folks. The first chapter, he opens with noting that white people seem to be curious about what it's like to be considered a problem by society. He recalls the moment at which he first became aware of racism as a child, when a little white girl in his elementary school class refused to accept a greeting card he gave to her. Du Bois characterized the force of racial prejudice and alienation as a veil that separates Black people from whites and from the broader society in which we live. The veil produces a distinctive kind of subjectivity that Du Bois called double consciousness, a term that refers to the way Black people are forced to see themselves both through their own lens and through the hostile gaze of racism. This double consciousness leads Black people to experience a tortured sense of internal conflict and confusion. Today, we welcome you to become active listeners to 7 Black men who are courageous enough to engage us by giving us a peek into their lives where racism, classism, heterosexism, and yes, even cisgenderism plagues their realities. As an active listener, we invite you to listen intently so that you might become aware of the ways in which you perpetuate and even participate in systems that are in place to dehumanize and even threaten the livelihoods of Black and brown folks in this country. We invite you today to be intentional listeners. And if you find yourself becoming judgmental or irritated or have some form of discomfort by what you're hearing, before tuning out, we invite you to tune in, to turn to wonder and ask yourself, why do I feel this way? Or why am I irritated by what I'm hearing and seeing? Why am I so bothered by this conversation? We invite you to sit in your discomfort. We invite you to stay in this conversation. We invite you to continue to journey with us as we all wrestle with our own internal process with societal norms that dehumanizes our neighbors. Sitting in your own discomfort in this conversation, turning to wonder, is the kind of self-reflection that allows for you and I to begin to wrestle with the social norms in our culture that made way for ideologies that assume that one person is inferior to the other, and one's experience or other stories is inferior to the other. It's the kind of hate that normalized in systems that makes room for white supremacy. You are invited to this conversation, to listen, to reflect, and perhaps to begin your own process in what it means to be a co-conspirator in dismantling racism. The upcoming weeks and months, Scarritt Bennett Center is dedicated to hosting more Zoom calls that provides opportunities for us to be in conversation so that we all might be transformed and equipped to be co-creators of this beloved community that Martin Luther King dreamed of, where judging one another is not because of the color of our skins, but by the content of our character. Here at Scarritt Bennett Center, radical hospitality is our way. And our motto, one of our mottos, is hospitality is justice. So our guests, each of them, are very precious to us, and we take full responsibility for them while under our care. So while you are welcome to share your thoughts and even ask questions in the comment sections of our live feed today, please know, while difference of opinions are welcome, difference does not mean disrespect. Difference does not mean hateful or mean-spirited words that are aimed to hurt our guests. So our staff are on standby, and if we see any comments or questions that do not reflect love or kindness, we will delete them. While our invitation is open to all, we are intentional about how we treat each other in this space, because in this space, only love abounds. Because this conversation is emotionally driven by our experiences, I'm excited to welcome Osiris Wade, our mental health professional, who's given the responsibility to hold the emotional space today, to help us to name some stuff that can help us process properly. You will hear from him shortly. But to begin, it is with great joy to welcome Reverend Heath Caldwell, United Methodist pastor, president of the NAACP Nashville branch, and a brother who I'm grateful to call friend and co-laborer in these streets. Yes. Heath, welcome, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Charizina Jean-Marie, and thank you for the fantastic job on racial justice initiative you're doing at Scarritt Bennett Center. So, men, I am delighted to be able to facilitate this conversation. I want to ask that each of you do a 5-minute or less opening, and with the question, what does it mean to be Black, a Black man in America? And I'd like to start with Dr. Michael Seabury. Would you tell us about what that means for you by way of introduction?
Absolutely. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Michael Seabury, known as Michael in the streets. I could say a lot about, what it means to be a Black man in America, but I'll start with a poem that I wrote maybe a year ago or so. It's very, very short. It says, "Have you ever been close enough to hear a butterfly make noise? How everything about butterflies has been proven sacred enough to put into a conservatory where we monitor those who enter and exit, making sure we monitor their bodies, their homes, and their offspring. The butterfly effect is when the flap of one butterfly's wings can cause a change in weather patterns weeks later. You see, this is a Black boy's life. The Black boy effect is how the drop of one body to the ground can cause a change in marching patterns of humans weeks later. How everything about Black boys has been proven sacred enough to put into a conservatory where we monitor those who enter and exit, and we make sure we monitor their bodies, their homes, and their offspring. The caveat is that butterflies have yet to go extinct. Black boys and men, we are still counting." For me, when I think of being a Black man in America, I think of, in a sense, carrying the burdens of restructuring what white communities have forced us to structure for years, right? So things like sexuality, religion, race, sex, gender, all of these things have been constructed for us for a number of years. And when we are not going along with what they have structured, then that's when we're put into these, systems where they're able to monitor us. Whether that be school systems where you have the school to prison pipeline and they're monitoring via behavior, whether that is an actual prison system and they're literally monitoring where you are, what you eat, what you do, and how you rehabilitate yourself to go back into community. All of these things have, in a sense, and not totally, but in a sense, become the burden of a Black man in this country to restructure it, or to say, well, what are you going to do to change it? How are you going to go along with the system? And that can be burdensome in many ways. I also think that being a Black man in America looks at the intersections and how we live our lives. So not just religion and not just race, but how religion is raced. And so I say that to mean, like, if you are Christian, how does being Black, play a role in that? And all of those things: ableness, sex, gender, and identity, as I mentioned earlier. as a Black cis queer man, as I identify myself, cis meaning I was born male and I identify as man. To be a Black cis queer man in America means a lot. It means redefining, reinterpolating everyday actions that help us to find peace, solace, and safety in a sense as well. So for example, if someone says Christianity is the right way, and that is, how majority thinks or what society is telling you you should be doing, as a Black cis queer man, sometimes we have to figure out where do we fit in those places. Because not every identity follows along with what society says. So then that leaves us questioning, well, how does my level or my version of Christianity fit within the mainstream context, which is a heteronormative space? And even beyond that, in another panel that I was in recently, Ring the Alarm for Black gay men again are responding to COVID-19, Reverend Brenton Brock mentioned about scripture and how not all the time the Bible for Black cis queer men or Black queer men in general does the Bible really fit us, or can we find ourselves in that? So where do we find our scripture? Is that in James Baldwin's books? Is that in people like George M. Johnson, who released All Boys Aren't Blue, or reading Audre Lorde or Maya Angelou or whoever it is? Is that where we find our scripture? And then also the last thing I want to say is that masculinity means that in society, you're mentally guarded, you're physically fit, you're emotionally isolated. But for a lot of Black cis queer men, where do we fit our manhood within that? How does that lead us to what we define as manhood? If I'm someone who can bow down, hates working out, can spill all of my feelings in a poem or on a Facebook post, that doesn't fit in society's definition of what manhood or masculinity or being a Black man means. And so we're constantly trying to figure that out. And the very, very last thing I'll say is, something I wrote here is that being a Black man in America can literally feel like heaven or hell on any given day. And then being a Black cis queer man in America, and I put those in that order on purpose, Black, then cis, then queer. Not only we deal with finding heaven or hell on any given day, but sometimes we're forced to create our own heaven in the midst of a hell that society places us in, not that we are necessarily feeling that we are in that moment.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You were right at 5 too. All right, brother Chidi, Afulezi. What the same question? What does it mean to be a Black man in America? 5 minutes, please, sir.
Sure. So I'm Chidi Afulezi, and my background is I was born on the West Coast, Eugene, Oregon, beautiful city, in the state of Oregon. I grew up in Nigeria. Right. So at the age of 5, I moved back to Nigeria, spent about 14 years there, and then spent my late teens, adult formative years in New York City. And so, it's been a very interesting experience being a Black man, especially here in the United States. And, I grew up in a country where being a Black man, it's just, you're pretty much an alpha, right? You're an alpha, you're at the top doing your thing. Around, you and with our sisters, we're just focused on being excellent, right? So excellence is just what we were doing. We're just trying to kind of compete with each other. We'll compete for each other. And then you moved back to the United States as a teenager with, you kind of have you have all your feathers kind of cocked up and you're ready to go. And then, in New York City, right? This is like, I came back to New York City when hip hop was really going through this transition. And so we were literally under fire as a Black man. And so it was a jarring experience. Okay. It was literally, I was kind of pulled in from almost a fantasy world of, and I don't say that lightly, right? A fantasy world of all Black people, you're a Black man in an all Black environment. So, race is just not your thing, right? It's just, we were dealing with other issues, but not race, right? And even with what you see on TV and what you see in the movies, you're just saying, look, that's just a different world, right? That's not my world. But then once you're immersed in that world, it's a jarring experience. And it takes a while to adjust to that. That's what happened to me, right? It took me a while to adjust to that because there was a time when I used to say, well, why is he running? Why is he running? He should just raise his hands, right? Why is he, he should stop mouthing off. What's he so angry about? But before you know it, you're experiencing it yourself. Amadou Diallo was shot when I was going to school in New York at NYU, and he was shot, 46, 47? I can't even remember if it was more than that, right? And he's, of the diaspora just like me, okay? I remember going to school with Haitians, Jamaicans, Trinis, Ghanaians, Guyanese, my brothers and sisters, we were all striving, all from the diaspora. We came into America to achieve, and then we started getting butt-headed by the system. Okay, so as a Black man coming up in New York, for me, I found myself saying, wow. Okay, so you kind of pull back. And then what I was doing, I started learning from my stateside brothers and sisters, my cousins, right? I started learning. I would actually stand side by side and say, okay, what's going on here? Let me get a good grip on what's going on. What I'll do is, we'll carry this conversation, as we go forward today. But I did want to kind of pull in the fact that, okay, you take it, go to school, you go through those experiences, you go into corporate America. And there was this one statement that is always stayed with me. It cut me. And it was that Chidi lacks executive presence. There was this one statement that was used even as I was rising through my corporate career, even though I was more educated, even though I was more knowledgeable, even though I was better dressed, even though I was more put together, I was more articulate, more empathetic. I was clearly more respected by my colleagues, the junior folks, and many of my fellow, execs. And yet Chidi lacks executive presence. And so that was something that I know I wasn't dealing with on my own in corporate America. And it's something that drove me out of corporate America, because no matter what happened, no matter how good I was always told Chidi lacked executive presence. I don't know what the hell that means. And excuse me, I'm starting to get riled up already. But it was something that was used against me, against many of my brothers and sisters, because that also applied to our Black women. And so that has driven me. Every time I go back to the continent, I revel in the Blackness, and I bring that back so that I can use that as we continue to fight the battle. So this is really a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm looking forward to kind of diving into these issues with the brothers here today. But there's a lot of nuts here to crack, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Brother Chidi. Now we want to introduce Reverend Dr. Forrest Harris, president of American Baptist College. In fact, he was the president when I was in undergrad. I want to thank Dr. Harris for creating a pathway from American Baptist College to Vanderbilt for scholars. Dr. Harris, please, same question. What does it mean to be a Black man in America? 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith, Caldwell. I am just excited and privileged to have the opportunity to be in this dialogical moment with all of you, and to address a question that perhaps has inexhaustible meanings for many people as it relates to Blackness in America, particularly Black males. I was born in the Southern ethos of race and culture in the deep Memphis, Tennessee area, North Memphis, where I experienced as a boy a solid community, Black community, that had developed ways to understand who they were and how they could exist within a context of race and culture and racism and dominant ways in which they were defined. And I didn't realize as a boy how much that community was a gift to me, to my 9 brothers and sisters, my father and mother being a part of the Black church, and how they gave us a sense of deep character and strength and faith, until I became an adult, until I became aware of the systems that they had fought and systems that they had resisted, and the systems that had attempted to define them, a system that had misdiagnosed who they were. And all of a sudden, as an adult in college and then on into professional life, I began to put much of this together. And what I came to understand about myself is that it has been a struggle for them now, a struggle for us a struggle for the larger Black community for an identity unaffected and not impacted by systemic racism, white supremacy, and privilege. And we still are fighting for that identity and to understand ourselves and to deconstruct what white definitions of life have meant. I now, in terms of my work at Vanderbilt Divinity School as professor of Black Church Studies and president of American Baptist College, I have made a commitment over the years to make sure every student that I can touch through scholarship, through interaction and dialogue, and through education, that they understand the ontological qualities of Blackness undefined by whiteness. Because whiteness has created a Blackness that is not the Blackness that we inherited from our ancestors. It's a Blackness that is deep and ontologically touched by divinity that I think we need to pass on to the next generation. And it's a difficult struggle because it is a continuous accumulation of cultural trauma and violence and all the things that keep repeating itself in the light of what Black people have experienced in this country. From slavery up into this present moment of Ahmaud Arbery's violent death in Brunswick, Georgia, we see continuously, even in the COVID-19 pandemic, how violence and all of the disparities and all of the heavy load that Black people have to carry in order just to know who they are and to flourish as human beings. I am really tired, as I'm suspecting many of my colleagues on this call is tired. Black church is weary. Every aspect of who we are in our culture is weary of trying to deal with white supremacy and racism against what it means to be Black in this country. One of the things that I did early in my career at Vanderbilt is we led a national discussion on what does it mean to be Black and Christian in America. And in that national dialogue with Black church leaders and many people who shared in that discussion, I discovered that this misdiagnosis of Blackness based on white definitions of it is still very much a part of the fabric of Black consciousness. Until we work through that misdiagnosis and see how it has been embodied, how it has been embodied in the way Black people behave and act toward themselves and the violence we see in our communities, we are going to continuously have this challenge and this kind of conversation, which is very much needed, and for how we can find ways to expose that trauma and find therapeutic healing within our own sense of who we are. So I'm very, very thankful that Charisma John Marie, who I met at Vanderbilt as she was a student there, and Heath, on this call and with these other distinguished colleagues to see can we start correcting that misdiagnosis, because in that misdiagnosis, injustice continues to occur, and we need to find justice within and beyond these systems of oppression. I'll let it end there and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
All right, thank you, sir. So the next panelist will be Brother Michael Springer. Same question, what does it mean to be a Black man in America?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. It was great to be on the panel with you guys. Again, my name is Michael Springer-Ingram. I am originally from Manchester, New Hampshire, a predominantly white space, and a space with not a lot of people in general. And as I answer this question, what does it mean to be a Black man in America? I'm kind of going to use my story more or less to, reflect exactly what that means for me. As I hear, my peers and colleagues on the panel put words to things that I've experienced and things that I'm wrestling with today, it's definitely affirming to know that, I'm not alone in these spaces. So I grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire, after where, you know, that in itself is such a, you know, that came with its own set of experiences where, you know, a lot of the times I was the only Black person in the room, or I was the only representation of people of color in different areas and spaces. And as I'm sure everyone can, you know, attest to or can relate to, that comes with its own set of pressures and challenges. You know, it almost comes with this this expectation, you know, that like the spotlight is on you a lot of the time, where it is, you know, undeservingly so. You know, you didn't do anything, you know, besides exist to be in that space, but yet all this pressure as a young teenager or a young adult is put onto you, and you know, the weight of the world's on your shoulders for that time, for that space. You know, and you know, going away to college. So I went to college in Bethany, West Virginia, another predominantly white state, and not a lot of people, but a very different experience. You know, growing up, I can't say that, you know, I experienced overt racism, you know, until maybe when I came to college and not only, you know, saw my peers, my friends, my colleagues start to wrestle with these different, very overt acts. But also it shed another light on me that, you know, there are things that in this world that I cannot control purely because that affect me purely because I'm Black. You know, I had not done anything to anyone. I had not made anyone feel any type of way towards me or towards my peers or colleagues or friends or family. There are things that, you know, they're just out of the realm of control. And there was a lot of helplessness in that space, you know, a lot of feeling like no matter what I did, good, bad, or indifferent, there was still this undercarriage of, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, at the end of the day, you know, you are still viewed through a specific lens that you cannot change for anybody, you know. And yeah, that kind of, you know, gearing towards, you know, after graduation, I went to Pittsburgh and spent some time in corporate America before going to Chicago. And I really, you know, felt exactly what Chidi was saying. You know, that was my first time in a space like that. And being in corporate America, even just for a year, you know, I saw a lot of these limitations that, you know, again, were just, they're limitations that were not self-imposed, you know, like they're like to break these ceilings, to break these expectations, you know, it almost felt like, you know, you became the exception and not the rule, you know. And like I talked to, you know, my friends and my family, and, you know, I know that I'm not an exception or that I am not overtly exceptional, but, you know, I am just, you know, I have been, I've been very fortunate and very lucky up until this point. And I think, you know, as what it means to be a Black person in America for me, as I kind of transitioned into where I was at, you know, I'm a law student now at the University of Chicago. And as I begin reflecting on these experiences that I've had and what I'm experiencing now, you know, things like insecurity, apprehension, you know, the need to be perfect, the need that, you know, the feeling that you're walking this tightrope and that there isn't a lot of room for flexibility, you know, that there are limitations and that, you know, no matter what I do, the ceiling is only so high, you know. And like that feeling is something that recently has become very real to me as I'm, you know, beginning to kind of navigate and decide, you know, what the next steps is for me. And, you know, it feels as if, you know, well, there are only a certain amount of steps that you can take. And
okay,
that's
Brother Springer-Ingram, we'll come back to you.
Okay, no worries.
We're at 5, I'm sorry.
No.
We'll come back and please, for you to continue. The next panelist is Reverend Lewis Mitchell. Please tell us, what does it mean to be a Black man in America?
In 5 minutes or less. Thank you
Yes.
all so much for allowing me to be a part of this. I am honored and thrilled, and I'm just going to cut to the chase. I want to say what it feels like for me to be a Black man in the United States, because I don't claim the United States as all of America. I'm challenged by that notion. There are Black Brazilian men that may have a different experience, and Black Caribbean men, Black Canadian men. And I want us to be very careful about the language that we've learned that is this patriarchal and colonialist language that we are America. We are not. And so as a Black man in the United States, and someone who came to my manhood differently than the rest of you, I will say that it is constantly a challenge and a dance between privileges, parallels, perils, and responsibilities. And what I mean by that is that as a Black man, I now enjoy situational privilege, meaning that in my community, I get all the male privilege in the world. Outside of my community, I'm a suspect. And I can guarantee you that I have never been followed around the store because I was born with an F on my birth certificate. I can guarantee you that. And so the first thing that is true for me, going from a different lens of how I am viewed, is that all of a sudden, all of these things that I never noticed before as treacherous are now treacherous for me. There are ways in which I cannot move in the world in the ways that I used to, both with the paternalistic glance of men over people who are not perceived as men, but also with that slight kind of invisibility that I can kind of, ease into the creases and crevices without too much notice. When I talk about parallels, it is often challenging for me to recognize that as a Black man, I both wear the face of prey to a racist and colonialist country, but I also wear the face of predator intra-community. When I look at violence against women and against others who are not men, straight appearing men, the violence is often intraracial, meaning that my obligation and responsibility is both to the people in my community to protect one another as well as to feel protected. One of the things that I have observed in this time, and I'm going to tell you how it feels because that was the question. It feels like constant, unrelenting tension, unrelenting scrutiny, unrelenting responsibility, and always being pressed to look at the intersections of, now that I have this situational male privilege, what is the proper use of my privilege? Not to just rebut a place where I might be a chalk line anytime I walk outside my house, but for the people in my community who are already in the margins of the margins, in what ways do we as Black men mimic the hand of the oppressor intra-community? It's a complicated mix that I am called upon to always be looking at because I've been on the other side of that equation, and I can't ignore that those experiences have made me the man that I am.
Thank you so much. And then lastly, we'll have Brother Osiris Wade. If you'll answer the question, what does it mean to be a Black man in a U.S. context? And then, of course, you will serve as our mental health person today. So please, in 5 minutes for the first part.
I think I could do even less. I appreciate the opportunity. Wow. You guys simply blow my mind, the brothers on this panel. What does it mean? My phrase as a father of four is, and yet the Creator is well pleased. That's what it means to me. But what I heard from my brothers on the panel, it still is it's what I hear in my clinic or in my office. I think it was Brother Seabury that said, on any given day, it's heaven or hell. That's what I hear. I think it was Brother Chidi that said, whether it's on the street or in the boardroom, it's not enough. Reverend Harris, that misdiagnosis of who we are, of our story, of our narrative without white supremacy or whiteness, to discover our own story and tell that story. I love that. Also love Brother Michael, that perfectionism, that feeling of being not enoughness that we walk around with. I think there was a patient of mine that gave me an incredible session of whistling Vivaldi. If you've never seen that on TED Talk, we walk around wearing the mask and he could whistle Vivaldi. There was an incredible moment of how I think all of us as Black men may feel at one point or another. And then Brother Mitchell, What I heard from you is, as a man, that cha-cha slide of male gaze and male privilege. So all of these things at any given time, any given day, any given moment, to feel like we have that on our shoulders and our hearts, and we still have to protect ourselves and those people that we love, and yet God is still pleased. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, thank you. So Charisma, are we going to the Q&A now?
No, we're going to go to the question that I asked each of you to engage one another that James Baldwin talks about.
Okay. And so the question from James Baldwin says, to be a Negro and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage almost all the time. What do we hear when James Baldwin, with him saying this? What are some thoughts that come to mind for us? Dr. Harris, you're muted.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I think James Baldwin is on point. The pulse of Black life in America is that if any of us ever discovered the true sense of what it means to be a human being, over and against what distortions and illusions about our Black selves have meant in America, that tension constantly puts us in a state of rage at the constant effort by white supremacist definitions of Black life to render us as non-subjects or people without substance, people without really a sense and deep sense of what it means to know what it is to affirm life as Black people. And as we see the constant violence against that, the constant assault against that, you have to be in constant rage. It never lets you rest. It never allows you the free space to be fully embracive of a human being who has a heritage of Blackness in the world. And I think that is what Baldwin meant by being in constant rage, because we see the constant assault against the depth of who we are as human beings in our Black skin.
Yes. Are there others? And if we can make a distinction, what does it mean to be politically Black? You know, in terms of Black in body and culturally Black. If we could add that into the discussion. Are there others?
Yeah, I think that, so, and even looking at what you're talking about, politically Black and culturally Black too, if we look at James Baldwin in general and look at who's saying this quote, we see a lot of layers that are already there. Someone who is, sort of like leaning queer, someone who is internationally traveled, someone who sees the whole world versus just seeing, the southern states where we know most of racism to exist. Of course, it's pervasive across most of the United States, or if not all of the United States. But if we look at it from that perspective, one thing I like to point out is that to be Negro and conscious, as it says, is not a place that you can run. Just like what was mentioned, it's literally always there, whether you're in London, whether you're visiting, places on the continent of Africa, Australia, does not matter, that there's always some sort of issue that is happening where if you are conscious about it, you're in constant rage. And whether that's politically Black, and you're looking at someone who, if we look at the Black or the African diaspora, someone who falls under that, and they are Black Brazilian, they are Afro-Latina, they are, living in Brixton in London or something, in these Black neighborhoods, any of that falls into play in it. And it's not just, the United States, it's not just America, but it's looking at Negro internationally and how we all are in this sense of rage because of what's going on. And even going along with that sense of rage, how sometimes I'll use an I statement because I can't speak for everyone, sometimes I am towing the line of, I would much rather be blissfully ignorant right now because I'm tired of being enraged. Even, for example, when Alton Sterling happened in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I was living 7 miles from the gas station where he was killed. And I could not take myself out there to actually fight. And I'm always, at the marches and at the things and writing the pieces. And for that one, I was like, I can't do it. I'll help everybody else behind the scenes, but I am tired of being in such a rage that I'm just going to step back for a moment and let everybody else handle it.
Well, we certainly don't want you blissfully ignorant or any of us, because sometimes that's easy, for us to do. Let's think about what it means, because we can't stay enraged. So
right.
what's the go-to? And I guess we should name the global impact of white supremacy. So as you stated, in the diaspora of Blackness, because of the definition of white supremacy has ascribed to it and the devaluation of humanity that comes with that, it seems to be inescapable from that standpoint. What are some other thoughts that folks may have?
Yeah, so I wanted to say something about that. Anger, which is rage, anger. I feel they're pretty much the same thing, right? But there's a quote that says that rage or anger is a hot coal that you hold in your hand while waiting to throw it at someone else, right? And so what that means is that hot coal is going to burn you. It's going to maim you. It's going to do something to you. And so, when that rage is there, I mean, you feel it in your system as it starts to kind of manifest and start to boil over, right? But I think with folks like Dr. Wade and just all of us on this call, even from a political standpoint, the goal has to be how to channel that, right? To turn it, from potential energy that's boiling up into kinetic energy that you essentially unleash on the world, right? And so, a really great example, and this is a fun example. I can never get enough of Angry Obama, right? When Key and Peele came up with Angry Obama, it literally was one of, if Black men don't know, that is one of the best things that's ever come out in terms of how you channel how it is to be a Black man in America, right? Because, Obama knows that he can't go and flip off the same way that his successor is doing right now, going on Twitter, mouthing off. He can't do that, right? And so those guys caught that. And to the extent that the president in his last year was able to say to himself, okay, you know what, let me bring this guy. I'm going to go to some comedic event and I'm going to bring Angry Obama, right? That tells you. And then he even went off, actually President Obama at some point got angry and Angry Obama was looking at him like, dude, you need to calm down, right? Imagine what that guy has felt. I mean, imagine what he's dealing with now, right? And so for me, that's what I see. That's kind of a microcosm of what we deal with, which is that anger has to be converted. It is energy, this fuel that has to be converted. Because if it's not converted, then as Reverend Mitchell was saying, now you start to channel that towards other people inside our community. We suffer when a Black man is so angry, he has a hot coal in his hand and he's ready, he's burning himself while looking for someone to throw it at, right? So for me, that anger, it's there, but I think what we need to do with that rage that, James Baldwin talks about is, yes, we live with it, but it doesn't mean that we have to live with it, right? We need to kind of take it and channel it. And that's what I love about what we see in this day and age is just a proper channeling. People are channeling this thing in such a way that there are positive results. The impact on our community is incredible, right? It's stuff like this, it's conversations like the ones that we're having. So I just wanted to share that when it comes to rage.
That's good. So Chidi or others, can we say a word about why President Obama could not behave that way versus why the current president can? That's just for the listening audience, just a thumbnail sketch of why. Is there someone who'd like to speak to that?
President Obama is a Black man who's under constant scrutiny, and the current occupant of the White House is a narcissistic, wealthy white man who holds himself accountable for nothing that he says or does. He has no capacity to hold himself accountable. He never has. He will probably not have that capacity in his lifetime. And, there's a way in which being able to alchemize the burning energy of rage has been our superpower since we've been on this continent. Yeah. We've always had to do it. We've always had to practice that kind of alchemy, whether we're alchemizing it into jazz or quilting or creative industries making something out of nothing. This is what we do. However, the fact that we have to do it is that part that chafes still. even if we're the most creative people on the planet, and I suspect we are, even though we have learned to alchemize this rage readily into hip hop and dunking the basketball and every other appropriated thing of art and beauty and creativity, the fact that we must alchemize this rage in order to survive seems to be the unanswerable question over and over and over again. And I think I'm really challenged by this notion of both the multiplicity of who James Baldwin is and the ways in which we are easy to quote James Baldwin, but hesitant to ever talk about our homophobia while doing so. This is challenging for me as a part of a community that lifts up the creativity of this part of the Black community. But it's as my mom's pastor says, you can't embrace and disgrace with the same arms. Either we are a part of Blackness or we're not. You cannot continue to utilize us and then throw us away at the next turn. So it's a challenging dynamic because even with white oppression and white glance on us, even when we return home to our own community, we return home to closed doors and toxicity and abuse. So where can this Black man go to be in community and feel safe? This is a challenge for me. While I'm battling, I got to battle them and you too. For real, that's too many things.
Yes.
Well said, Brother Mitchell.
So that's a really good point. You talk about the intersections of oppression here with really the sexism, homophobia, and how they converge on each other. What do we think about this idea? You talked about how creative Black folks have been with necessity being the mother of invention, right? And this absolute need to create, to alchemize is the term, and to transmit differently the energy that's coming. What are some other thoughts that any of the men on the panel have about that? Like how we can create productive energy out of that? Because I look at it as a righteous indignation for me. That's how I convert that energy into a righteous indignation. What do others do?
Brother Q.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Before we move on from Brother Mitchell's comment, put on that list the bigotry that we have in our community against each other. So I don't want to leave that what he said without putting that on the list. Okay.
Yes.
And if we can go back to the eternal rage and anger that we have as Black men walking around, from a health standpoint or a mental health and wellness standpoint, the damage that it does to us from that aspect is so impactful that I beg each and every Black man, teen, boy, to make sure that they have a mental health provider, not because from a mental illness standpoint, but because there are so many weapons developed against us.
Okay, so again, that's a really good point, and that's why I'm glad you're on the panel. Let's talk a little bit about the homophobia that Black men that we have in our community, and that kind of erasure that is often committed. What are some thoughts from the panelists?
Well,
He's back. You're back.
Okay, great. Heterosexism, patriarchy, white patriarchy, Black male patriarchy, and masculinity are topics that really allow us to know how deep the systemic definitions of Blackness has been based upon white definitions of beauty, white definitions of sexuality, white definitions of what is a understanding of being an American. And I think we have to deconstruct all of those misdiagnoses to get to homophobic treatment of Black male sexuality or sexuality, period. Those fears have been ingrained in our thinking based upon how masculinity and sexuality have been defined in this country. And we have, in our consciousness and in our practice, been co-opted into that patriarchy, into that sexuality, into those notions, and we do much harm to the beauty of Blackness and sexuality and the expressions thereof. And I have to just claim that struggle has been among those of us who have thought to understand heterosexual normativity as the way of life over the gangs, allowing people to discover themselves in the best way that they know themselves by the freedom that they deserve. And we've not just been able to do that, particularly in the Black churches, particularly in the traditionalism and thought of our community and families. We've done a lot of harm. And on top of that harm, racism continues to pounce upon us in terms of new ways that it mutates and causes for a new generation to go through these channels of pain and not have healing ways to be safe or spaces to be safe when one can discover their true selves.
That's beautifully stated, Dr. Harris. Would anyone else care to chime in on that?
I would. I would contend to say that, and to put it simply, homophobia is ignorance. And I say that because to me, when I experience homophobia, or when I even see it in other communities or see it on TV shows or in group chats, whatever it is, it's always centered from a place of I don't understand, or I haven't been there, or I haven't seen it. So because I don't get it, because I don't understand it, I'm just gonna block it out completely because I can't, wrap my mind around it.
Yeah.
And that in itself is even centered, if we really want to get down to it, centered in historical roots. Just as was just said by the president there, is that there are systems and systematic principles that have been put into place that impede people from understanding what being homosexual is, or any form of LGBT, whether a trans person or queer or bi or whatever. There are just systems that are in place. And I'll say from my own experience, the place that I see it the absolute worst is in school systems. As a K-12 teacher, I teach high school science in Metro Atlanta. And as a school teacher, a high school teacher, where I'm in the classroom every day with students, I see and hear the most disgusting things that I know have not been rooted in that person or in that child, but is rooted from their parents, which is probably rooted from their parents, which is most likely, if we look at it in the Black community, rooted from the Black church, which comes from slavery as well. Not saying the whole Black church comes from slavery, but some of the ideas and some of the ideals that we live in and live within come from slavery. And those things that kind of making a connection here, which some people might think is absolutely crazy, but in the same way that slavery was justified through the Bible from white folks, so is homophobia. It's also justified through the Bible, where and to talk about my personal, like I said, my I statements, I've experienced my own pastor, my childhood pastor, telling me that I was going to go to hell because of this particular scripture that was, one, taken out of context as well, and used as sort of a lash to say, this should not be happening. This is unnatural, right? And when you get that with little kids or high school kids, that becomes ingrained in them. And so when they see anything different from them, whether it's actually gay or trans or bi or queer or not, they label it as that, and they label it as, I don't want that, right? So whether a man wears a pink shirt, although pink is not equivalent to any sexuality or any gender identity at all, they immediately start labeling those things as gay because it's something they don't understand, something that's different from what they do. So I say that to plead to people that we have to start utilizing these, systems that are these new ways that we debunk the systems. Because if you could just hear the things that happen in high school classrooms and middle school classrooms on how they're perpetuating this system that their parents is teaching, you'd be disgusted and outraged as well.
That's good. And so I heard you name the church as a primary site of transmission of this kind of worldview that wants to oppress folks who are same gender loving. Kelly Brown Douglas puts it as they place a sacred canopy over this idea. And so you can't even begin to talk about it because there's a sacred canopy that says, because this is what God has said. Are there any thoughts around that?
Yeah, yeah. So let me share something with you. So I come from a diaspora community that, quite honestly, we can be a little, okay, not a little. It's quite rough, right? When it comes to this conversation. And I'll tell you, even myself, coming back from Nigeria, in 1990 and going to New York City, starting school at NYU, that was, I went there with my preconceived notions. But hey, I went to NYU, Greenwich Village. It doesn't get any more, in your face than that. And I learned, right? So Michael talked about ignorance, right? I learned, right? I actually learned. And that's what this is all about. It's all about learning. President Obama, and I'll use him again because he's a very interesting kind of, he's a pinpoint when it comes to these kinds of conversations. When he voiced support for the gay community, he lost a lot of support in the Nigerian community, in the African community. They actually said, what's wrong with this guy? And a lot of folks actually started saying, okay, we need to start looking for other alternatives in terms of our political ideology. And so, Michael is absolutely right. This is a thing about, it's about education. It's about, the unknown. And I'm going to actually corral this conversation to what you will call the American versus the continental Black person, right? Or the U.S. Black versus the continental Black. The folks who come from the diaspora, especially Africans. I know there's been a significant amount of angst and even, a level of aggressive bitterness towards, who are the successful Blacks in America. And, many times you'll see statistics on how Africans are doing very well in school. The level of education in terms of the accumulation of degrees is very high. And, I've seen some really tough, feedback from some in the community, especially when it comes to the men. Whenever you say, look, I'm Nigerian, and look, I was born in the US, but I claim my Nigerianness, I claim my Blackness as a Nigerian. And, you kind of get the snide remarks about, okay, you're Nigerian, right? And there are connotations that come with that. There's a sterilization that happens, right? Where we are almost stripped of that, that thing that makes all of us Black, especially with the men, where we're just looked at, okay, we're kind of docile. We'll do whatever the white man asks us to do in order to do well in our careers or in our academic, exploits. And so it comes back to the lack of knowledge, the PTSD on both sides. Quite honestly, there's PTSD on the continental side and there's PTSD over here. And when PTSD meets PTSD, Dr. Wade, you probably have a term for that. And because I don't know what the hell that is,
Dr. DeGroote calls that post-traumatic slave disorder. That's her term.
Wow. So again, Keith, I didn't mean to kind of take this away from the original thrust of the conversation. But again, I'm going back to where Michael talked about ignorance. And that's the challenge for many of the Black men here is, there's a lot of education, learning, when the learning aspect of being a Black man, that needs to, and I'm not talking about going to school. I'm talking about getting to immerse yourself in stuff that is foreign to you, right? Foreign, capital F, where you get to say to yourself, okay, I need to know more about this before I start mouthing off, before I start saying stupid things, before I start hurting myself and others, right? So I just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Yeah, that's really good. So I want to piggyback on what you're saying and what Michael said just a moment ago. When we think about this internalized colonization, is really how we are playing that out. Let's think about this issue with LGBT. Right now, I'm in a church that's about to split over that issue, right? Mm-hmm. And racism is a pre-existing condition, right? That LGBT gets played out on top of that. And when I talk to people who say that they come to some level of enlightenment around LGBT, it's because they had a family member or someone whom they loved that they could still see their humanity. And so there's conversions that are taking place versus in racism, the idea that Black and brown people, particularly Black people, aren't fully human. And so there's this anthropological misreading around Black folks not or not being children of God, not being fully human, the curse of Ham, right? And so I just want to name some of those factors that have been that have migrated into that understanding. So if we don't get our anthropology right, then we can never get our theology or our sociology right. So it'll continue to play out in very harmful and destructive ways. What are some thoughts?
I just want to share something very briefly as someone who was recently ordained. I thank God for that. And someone who was sent running from the church and found my path being led back to the church. Sometimes I think against my will, but sometimes when you say yes, you don't read the fine print. But one of the things that I have found to be true is that the larger white LGBT community is decidedly secular. They're trying to add some things right now, but I've found for me, and part of the origin of creating Transfaith is that for many of us, our spiritual journey was a part of our self-awareness, of gender identity, of affectional orientation. It came through a place of spirit. There is always the assumption from the outside that it comes from our loins and finally makes it someplace else. But that is not the reality for most of us. It comes from an internal knowing of seeing something that no one else but you seems to be able to see. And I trace my spiritual heritage back to that African eunuch who opened the door for non-Jews to become Christians. I claim that as my spiritual ancestry. And so I challenge any Christian to kick me off a boat that I helped launch. So I'm not doing that with anybody.
Yeah,
but what I will say is that what's important here is not, yes, ignorance is a factor and knowledge helps, but the awareness that love is not the same as approval is going to be at the core. I can love you and not worry about acceptance or approval. I don't have to understand your lifestyle. I don't have to approve of your lifestyle. If you're a Black man and you're a police officer, I may not approve of your choice, but I love you, bro. Help me understand how you came to that place. We put so much impetus on understanding. Some people are never going to understand my journey. Hell, I wouldn't have understood it unless I went through it. So I ain't mad at you for that. But I insist that you love and respect me while you work through your educational issues if you want to do that.
That's right.
This, my mom, who is like very, very religious, when I came out to her, she said, I may never accept the decisions you make, but I will always love you. You are my child. And that was all I needed. And here I am with my mom at home. 20 years later, she invited me home. We've come full circle from her not knowing how to deal with me and not knowing how to have questions to inviting me and embrace me in your heart first. Your mind will follow where your heart sends you.
Okay, that's great. Charisma, I think it's time for to kick the questions out to Facebook, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. Thank you. What? Oh my God, just so much. I am overwhelmed. Dr. Harris, the first question comes to you. This is based on what you said earlier today. The question is, what does Blackness undefined by whiteness look like? Is that attainable? And how can we define ourselves? How can we Black people define ourselves and survive in a white America?
That's a great question. And it's one of those kinds of questions Charisma John Marie would ask in class, or Keith Caldwell. And it takes 2 class sessions to unpack. The first is the recognition that the question itself makes, is that has been a construction of Blackness that is untrue and misdiagnosed and applied to the realities that don't represent us. So the first is to get to the depth of that understanding and that construction, to see how white supremacy and white privilege and racism throughout the history of Black people in America has attempted to shape who we are, what it is that applies to us as people. And that is a whole discourse. That's a whole psychological, sociological, anthropological journey that we must unpack those distortions. We must see them for what they are. And they have many kinds of tentacles, social, psychological, ethical tentacles that you have to begin to organize in a way that allows for you to come forth with a truth or canon of truth that applies to Black life in America, but Black life beyond those definitions. So I think the question implies that if it is possible, it's because we discover our own canons of truth. Whether it is through the literature of a James Baldwin or through the alchemy and the creativity of Blackness as it expresses itself in survival and liberation modes, we have to begin to develop our canons of truth to unpack the distortions of white Christianity in America, to unpack how in our own efforts to understand the divinity and the gifts of divinity in human life, that distortion cannot help us unless we define our own understanding of what it means to be who we are as a people. I'll answer it that way.
Yeah, that's
From
great.
being a long answer, but that's a shorter version of what was a long answer.
Yeah, that's great. Osiris, and this was mentioned earlier, but I think we need to go back to it because it's language that some might not recognize. Would you please help us understand what is post-traumatic slave syndrome? What is it? How does that show up in our experiences? And how can we find, or how can we go and get support for that?
Of course. Dr. Joy DeGruy, who's a PhD in social work, I believe, she coined the term PTSD, post-traumatic slave disorder, post-traumatic slave syndrome. She is an incredible author and speaker on this term. And basically what it is a look at intergenerational trauma. And what she believes is if we were to look honestly at America's legacy at not getting African Americans help, if you will, not looking at how do we look at the legacy of chattel slavery and then Reconstruction and Jim Crow and all the way through all these years, hundreds of years, and none of us, our ancestors, have never received any help. There's something in our bones or something in our DNA that needs to be addressed. Now, oftentimes, I love to hear her talk about this. We can have a discussion about the Jewish community. We can have a conversation with or about the Native American or First Nation community, Aboriginal. We can have conversations about every other community. But when we look at Africans in this country, it's very difficult for us to look at our trauma and how white superiority or white or racism has impacted us on a cellular level, and how every single system, education, health, every single aspect of our lives basically comes back to we did not and still do not have a healthy way of living in many aspects. And that was her term that she actually came up with, and it's an incredible book.
Thank you.
That and Dr. Robin DiAngelo, I think it is, White Fragility. Both of those books in concert should be read by every single person.
Mm-hmm. Would you name those two books again so that we can put it on our comments for references for our audience? The book and the authors.
Yes, the first one, Dr. Joy DeGruy, PhD, and the book is PTSD, Post-Traumatic Slavery Syndrome, Enduring Injury and Healing, something like that. Second one, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. Both have TED Talks, I believe.
I'm actually reading White Fragility this summer. It's a very powerful book that I encourage others to read. Michael Springer, this question comes from your comments, so I'm going to address you, but any one of you can respond. And Keith Caldwell, I welcome you to also responding because we haven't heard from you since you were moderating. Say more about this need to overperform in order to be a good Black person. Is that such a thing? Speak more about that. What does that look like? What does that mean? What impact does that have on your emotional and even spiritual presence in the world?
Yeah, so I guess the word that comes to mind immediately is almost this sense of tokenism. So the idea that, you know, you're given this expectation that's been put onto you that you didn't necessarily ask for, that you can't really escape, that you can't really, you're forced to grapple with it almost by like a trial by fire situation, but also it's a feeling and emotion and experience that hasn't necessarily been learned or taught, you know, and I guess it's something that, you know, again, speaking for myself, but it's something that I've had to learn trial by error, you know, and like the question I think was, you know, like, what about this need to be a good Black person? I guess that I find, I guess that phrasing, I guess I find to be a little exhausting, but also a lens that I guess I've heard before and have experienced, you know, through my own lens or hearing the stories of other people. I guess it's something that, you know, it's an expectation that has been thrown on that, you know, that you're either a good Black person or a bad Black person. And I don't necessarily agree. Well, I don't agree with that, period. But it is very much something that, you know, I don't know, you can almost feel it in a room, you know, like a determination that has been made by someone that, you know, oh, okay, I know what bucket you fall in now. And that is very disheartening, you know, because, you know, not only we complex as individuals, but, you know, as a Black male who's trying to navigate and find their own path in this world that, you know, I didn't ask to be in, that I didn't, you know, that I'm trying to find my own path. It's disheartening to, one, have these limitations imposed on me that I haven't imposed on myself, but two, to already have my fate, how someone feels about me, how I'm perceived based on one microcosm of an interaction. You know, I think that, you know, they're doing themselves a disservice, you know, to put anybody into a bucket like that, you know, and to view other people like that, specifically Black people. It's this level of reductionism that, you know, I don't see in other spaces very frequently.
Heath, I'm going to invite you to jump in. I think one of the things that Michael Springer is alluding to is the white gaze. Talk a little bit more about the white gaze.
Yeah, so the white gaze evolves out of this brutal legacy of white supremacy, right? And we can track this, and we can actually track it from the papal bulls, you know, and we know 1492, right, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I mean, if we could just go back to when Isabella and Ferdinand were actually saying, in order to be a citizen of Spain, that you had to be Christian. And so when Jews and Moriscos, who were ostensibly Arabs or Blacks, converted, they said that your baptism was not complete because of the continuity of your bloodline. So in that historical moment, Christianity ceased to be about a conversion of faith practices, and it became a biopolitical reality. And so it sailed into what we call the New World on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, with the interiority of Christianity gutted out and the ideology of white supremacy replacing that, while holding on all the iconography, the images, and even the cross. But it is far from the first century life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And so that gets codified in public policy and in this devaluation of Black embodiment that underwrites the entire new world. And so this dehumanization, so it's not even so much as the economic exploitation, which was horrendous, but what was required by Christians to do this to other human beings is the unconscionable thing. And so that gaze actually is more a surveillance. And so there's no respectability politics that one can perform to get out from under that, because it's a life sentence based on phenotype.
Dr. Seabury.
Before you ask that really quickly, can I add something to that?
Yes, please do.
I love this discussion, and it reminded me of a book that I read and quoted in my dissertation by Vershawn Young. If anybody has ever read him, he's an amazing writer. In his second chapter called So Black I'm Blue, he talks about how Chris Rock used a comedy piece about white people not being able to tell the difference between Black people. And then he labeled it as the burden of racial performance. So I think what Michael there, Ingram was talking about, and what Heath was talking about was sort of that burden of Black people having to literally perform a certain Blackness to be able to tell the difference between each other, to be able to make it to another room, to get invited to conversations. It's all this performance type stuff as well. And I'll type this book out too if you want to recommend it in the comments. It is called, so I don't know if the censor wants to recommend it for the title, but I mean, it is what it is. It's called Your Average Nigga, which is about race literacy and masculinity. So if anybody wants to check that out, that is the title of it. Very, very authentic book. And he uses that term intentionally as well, which is why I didn't mind sharing it here.
Yeah. Would you put that book up again so we can see it?
Yes.
We can put it on our comments. Your Average Nigga, Performing Race, Literacy, and Masculinity, Vershawn Asante Young. Thank you.
No problem. He's amazing.
I'm going to direct this question to you, Dr. Seabury. How do Black men reimagine their role in society outside of patriarchy?
Oh, Lord, that's literally my work. I can talk on this for days, but to make it really short, the way that we reimagine is literally by doing. I think that is the best way. We can theorize things all day. We can talk about and recommend books all day long, but by doing things that are in a sense contrary to what we believe masculinity to be in the eyes of patriarchy, that is the best way that we do that. And again, my lens is from looking at adolescents and K-12, and I think that they have a beautiful way of doing so. A lot of the research I do amongst high school students, looking at how do they define, do, and develop masculinity. And some of the things that we find in this research is that there are a lot of teenage boys or adolescent boys who are redefining it by allowing their relationship with Black male teachers to thrive, by hugging each other, by saying, I love you, bro, or I love you, brother, or I love you, friend, to each other. They are, washing dishes and doing things that patriarchy would describe as domesticated feminine responsibilities. But when you're reframing those types of things, Black boys can do those things too, vacuum and, do all these other things that in the 50s and 60s would have been looked at as a woman's job because of patriarchy, right? And I'm in no way endorsing that. I'm just stating the history. And so, like I said, by doing those things, so if there is a way in which they can find in their lives one or two avenues that they can reconstruct what patriarchy looks like, or reconstruct what masculinity looks like, or being a Black man or a Black boy, just start there. So literally, whether it's taking care of your little siblings, or cleaning clothes, or embracing other men physically and emotionally, whatever it is that was contrary to what society has taught us, embrace those things one by one, and eventually patriarchy won't look like it looks now. And hopefully patriarchy won't exist either anymore. It can be a true level playing field.
Awesome, yeah. So this
question,
yeah.
Prisoner, we have 10 minutes left.
Yes. Okay. We have 10 minutes. We do have 10 minutes left, so we're going to transition from the questions to you all.
I just need 30 seconds. 30 seconds, I promise. I just want to add to something that Dr. Seabury said. The only way that's going to work is if we can find the bedrock of our manhood away from ideas of gender essentialism. If we can't do that, then we don't have a chance in hell.
Okay.
Amen.
And so, Louis, we're going to give each person 2 minutes to go. We're going to go back around the horn. I want Dr. Harris to be the last panelist to speak. So we'll start with you, Michael, Dr. Seabury. 2 minutes, please. Just closing thought.
Absolutely. I just want to say, well, one, thank you for having me on this platform, but also just ending with the idea of, as we are having these discussions and moving forward, whether you're having them in your home, at work, at church, or whatever it is, always remember that the Black community, and this is something I like to throw out there, is that we're navigating spaces where we're uncovering hurt, transgressions, secrets, we're enduring a lot of trauma and whatnot. And a lot of that is centered around, as our conversation sort of was today, it's centered around LGBT issues. So remember the queer people in your life. Remember that they show up from a different perspective, and acknowledge that perspective, and give them the space to have that perspective also. And the last thing is, in the words of George M. Johnson, one of the greatest writers of today, in his book, All Boys Aren't Blue, he says, I know that queerness is a part of Blackness, and that there is no Blackness without queer people. So when you're discussing what being a Black man in America means, always remember that the queer perspective is one of the biggest perspectives in that definition.
How can our audience be in contact with you? How can we contact you, Dr. Seabury?
Oh, so my Facebook and Instagram and Twitter are best_adjacent. So BEST_adjacent. It comes from a quote in a rap song that says, if I'm not the best, I'm adjacent, because I work hard. So you can find me there, or Michael Seabury on Facebook as well. And then I'll have links on all of those to my website for consulting also.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Brother Chidi, 2 minutes, please, sir. You're muted.
There we go. So again, this has been such an enlightening conversation, and I do want to kind of stay on that enlightening piece, right? And I'm a practicing Stoic. It doesn't take me away from church. It's just a layer on top of my Christian beliefs. And Epictetus is one of the big Stoics, and he says, throw out your conceited opinions, for it is impossible for a person to begin to learn what he thinks he already knows. This is about learning. For me, it's all about being wise enough to ask questions and being humble enough to accept them and learn from those answers. That is what, when it comes to Black men in America, that is for me at the core of everything that we talk about. It's about learning. It's about learning, it's about unlearning, it's about relearning what it means to be a man, right? And again, we just, I think it's just so appropriate that Dr. Seabury, actually, I'm going to call you Michael because I don't want to use the doctor to take away the brotherness that you and I are feeling, right? I want to make sure that people understand that what he was saying there, this is about learning. It's about learning about our brothers and just getting to know them, immerse. I am viscerally Black. That's what I tell people. People say I'm viscerally Black. I love Black people. I love being around my Black brothers. I love being married to my Black, this Black wife that I have, my Black daughters. It is all about that, but I'm constantly learning. And I would never pretend that I know it all. I don't. I didn't come to this panel to spit wisdom. I came here to learn from my brothers, right? And so it is important for us to have that culture of learning. Once we become a culture of learning, it becomes so easy for us to channel our rage, channel that energy, to embrace each other and really push forward as a race. So, again, this has just been probably one of the more powerful conversations I've had this year. So thank you.
Chidi, how do we get in contact with you?
So probably the easiest way is my first name, last name.com, ChidiAfulezi.com. You will be able to find me. I'm a consultant. I'm a teacher. I do all kinds of things. I do carpentry. No, that's not true. My wife does not think I know how to do carpentry. So I don't do carpentry. But you can find me at ChidiAfulezi.com.
Put it in the comments, please.
Okay, we'll do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Brother Michael Springer-Ingram. We're going to keep moving.
Yeah, just kind of to echo what Chidi said, I feel like I've learned and unlearned and relearned, so many different things just through conversation and through the stories and just being a part of this panel. So to say thank you would be, it would not give it its proper gratitude for me. Keeping the conversation moving forward is kind of, the best way, I think, especially as, we're completely remote and being online, to leverage social media to give these thoughts and feelings and emotions a platform to where, we can congregate and have a good discussion. That's really helpful. And just thank you for allowing me to be a part of the platform. So.
Thank you. Reverend Lewis Mitchell.
Michael.
What'd you say?
How can we stay in contact with you?
You can on Facebook, Michael Springer-Ingram, or my email, mspringeringram, no hyphen, @gmail.com. So thank you guys.
Okay, thank you. Will everyone just put your contact information in the comments? Reverend Lewis Mitchell.
First and foremost, This has been an extraordinary blessing, and I'm so grateful. I've learned something from each of you, and I hope to continue to be in contact with you, continue to learn and grow. When we were talking about doing this, I was thinking about our diversity using 5 directional points. Jason Collins, Badass Boozy, Dwayne Wade, Billy Porter, and my friend Marquise Vilson. And I thought about the range and the depth and the beauty and the strength and the fragility and the woundedness of Black manhood. And in all of those things, my heart is just swirling with gratitude. And I want to say that I'm deeply grateful for the man that I am and the journey that I've had to be on to get here. I have deep love and gratitude for the many women of all origins, cis and trans, that could continue to help me be a better man, and of all the gender non-conforming people of all genders for helping me to break free from my own internalized gender essentialist thinking, my own paternalistic thinking, my own internalized homophobia and transphobia. I am so deeply grateful to have you who unknowingly were my mentors, for better or for worse. I have had my eye on you to see what kind of man I wanted to be. And I thank you for being present and visible and outspoken.
Thank you, thank you.
Your contact information, Louis?
No, we get.
Yeah.
www.transfaith.org.
Awesome, thank you.
Brother Osiris Wade.
Thank you. I love each one of you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'll just lead with turn up your heart space. And I look forward to working with each one of you in the future. I'll make sure that I put my contact information in the comments. I'll be obedient, Heath.
No, thank you. I'm not. We got 2 minutes. Dr. Forrest Harris.
Yes, this has been an incredible moment. I'm glad to have shared it. 3 things. I think to be Black in America and to deal with the oppression that has accumulated in our consciousness, we have to enter the domain of our own truth by being honest with each other. And internalized oppression can only be healed when we can have our own spaces, our own alliances to define who we are and to make that definition apply across our pain to our healing. I love the ontological qualities and dignity and divinity of Blackness, and we shall forever hold it up high in all the things that we do, what I do. I love my father who's deceased. I love my mother, my matriarch who still lives, my 9 siblings and brothers and sisters. But I love you because we are the kinship of the world as it relates to who we are. And we can find who we are to healing in that kinship. It was a good conversation and a good experience.
Yes, and I'm honored to have facilitated this deeply meaningful conversation. We'll give it to Reverend Charisma Jean-Marie for the last word. There you are, my sister.
Thank you. Again, I want to say thank you to each and every one of you. What an amazing experience. And I look forward to working with you all in the future. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. What does it mean to be a Black man in America? Next week, Scarritt Bennett Center partners with My Brother's Keeper, Nashville's chapters. We invite young people, the Black male youth, to come and share their experiences. Please join us next week at 2 p.m. Central Time as we hear from young Black men, young Black boys, young Black children, youth. They're not men yet. Young Black youth that will be able to come and share what does it mean to be a young Black youth in America. Join us. Thank you again and have a great one.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.